This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Claudine and Tokyo Tarareba Girls Volume 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who are academics and enjoy discussing manga. And on the official June manga episode, we're going to be looking at two recent works, both of which were released this month. We're going to start with Riyoko Ikeda's Claudine, coming out from 7 Seas Entertainment. And then after that, we're going to look at the first volume of Tokyo Tarareba Girls by Akiko Higashimura. And this is a Kodansha release. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by those great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, and you can get books like Naoki Takeuchi's Sailor Moon or Ayazawa's Paradise Kiss for 25% off each volume.
That's right. You know, you really can't beat the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service, whether your tastes go toward manga or Western comics. They have it all, and they have it at great prices. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, let's tell listeners that if you sound a tad different on this episode, that's because you're speaking to me now via your mobile phone, correct?
Yeah, we had a little bit of a technical difficulties, but we're managing to get, you know, the true June episode out to listeners.
That's right. And in fact, now that you've mentioned that this is the true June episode, yes, this is our true June episode. Now, listeners will know that for the past 2 months, Shea and I have been, I guess, a tad tardy when it comes to the manga shows. We came out with our April show in the early part of May. And then I think it was about 2.5 weeks ago, Shea, you and I came out finally with our May episode in June. And we had said at the time that even though we were last time looking at 3 titles, you know, more than we usually do on the manga shows, that we will try to get another episode out in June, which will be our actual June episode. And that's what this is.
Yes.
So we were able to do it, and we didn't want to let down our wonderful listeners.
That's right, because we care about you, and we want to brighten your month with talk of manga.
That's right. So the two titles that we're going to be discussing this month are Claudine by Riyoko Ikeda, and that's coming out from 7 Seas Entertainment. Came out this month, in fact. And the other text that we'll get to later in the show is Akiko Higashimura's Tokyo Tarareba Girls, and that is from Kodansha Comics. But we're going to begin with Claudine, I guess for a couple of reasons. One, Riyoko Ikeda is quite a famous figure in the world of manga, and we've never discussed her before. I think primarily because there are not many of her works that are translated into English. Another reason why we want to start with Claudine is that this book was originally published in Japan in 1978. And we think that this may be the first official English translation of the text. If anyone knows otherwise of an earlier English edition, please let us know. But I think this may be the first translation.
Like you mentioned, Ikeda's work has been kind of notoriously difficult to find in English, and so it was a great opportunity to finally be able to get one of her works and to be able to talk about it on the show. Yes.
Now, I guess we can go over the general premise of Claudine. This is the story about the title character, Claudine, a woman who feels herself to be a man. And in other words, she feels, at one point she says toward the end of the text, she calls herself, or maybe it may be the doctor who calls her this, an imperfect man, or the imperfect male, which kind of astounds her, but in a way she kind of feels that way because she does feel like a man trapped in a woman's body. And so, Shea, perhaps in discussing Claudine, the text, when we talk about the primary character, the protagonist, Claudine, perhaps we should refer to Claudine in the masculine gender.
I think that would be a good idea. I think that, and we can get into this, as we discuss the story, but, it's really about, a trans man, but it's, work from a time where the kind of language used to kind of describe and talk about that experience, it wasn't as refined or nuanced as it's gotten today. So there are instances of where he's called an imperfect man, and a lot of instances where the narrator even I would say misgenders him. But ultimately it's a story of a trans man, and I think talking about him using masculine pronouns is the appropriate way for us to talk about that.
Right. Now, you mentioned the narrator of Claudine, the book. The narrator is Claudine's doctor, and Claudine's mother takes him at some point when he's young to the doctor because of this issue of feeling like a male born in a female body. So I can't remember if the doctor's ever described as a psychiatrist. Is he toward the beginning of the text? I can't recall.
That was my general understanding, that I believe it's the first scene in the book where Claudine's mother takes him to this doctor. And my understanding was that he was a kind of what we would think of as a psychologist or psychiatrist.
Right. Oh, yeah. In fact, I see that point right now. I don't think he calls himself a psychiatrist, but he does say that he is a doctor, not of the body, but of the mind.
Right. And I'm not 100% sure when the book actually takes place. But yeah, my understanding was that he was a kind of an early psychologist or psychiatrist.
Exactly. Yeah. If he were a psychiatrist, then he would also be a doctor of the body because he'd have to be trained in that way, I would assume. So it could be a psychologist. But again, he is a physician. He is a doctor of some sort. And he becomes the narrator in that every now and again, not constantly, but occasionally, his voiceovers will pop up in the narrative to give us some kind of overview of what Claudine was going through at the time, his experiences, his relationships, the frustrations, the heartbreaks, and there are quite a number of those that Claudine experiences. So it's the doctor's voice that we get throughout as the narrator.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting narrative framework, I thought, for and I think it speaks to kind of what I was talking about earlier. It's this, like you said, was originally published in 1978, and so ideas about gender identity and gender expression were pretty different from what they are today. And so what you have here is essentially what we would call like a cis man describing the experience and interpreting the experience for us of this trans man. And I think that is in some ways, I think it is kind of part and parcel of the sometimes problematic aspects of the story. Like I mentioned, the kind of misgendering by him of Claudine, referring to him with feminine pronouns. But it's, what did you make of that? Because obviously I thought it was, not the most ideal way to kind of tell that story, because it does mediate it a little further than I would like. But I was interested in how you took that.
I'm okay with the mediation. And in fact, I think that I would prefer that to perhaps Claudine's direct telling of his own story. Of course, given what happens at the end, that wouldn't necessarily be possible unless we're talking about a Sunset Boulevard kind of experience here. But this is a very different kind of narrative. And listeners who are familiar with Sunset Boulevard, the film, know what I'm referring to here. But again, I don't want to give away any direct spoilers. But getting back to the point, I do like the fact that the doctor is the one who's narrating the story, because what that does, at least for me as a reader, is it underscores the misunderstanding that Claudine experiences throughout life. In other words, one of the driving forces, one of the motivations of the plot that moves it forward is the frustrations Claudine experiences, not only in her relationships, but also in terms of her friends and family members who really can't understand where he's coming from, feeling male, but being born in a female body, and the kind of issues that brings. And so the doctor, not really understanding things completely and then misgendering Claudine, as you put it, again, brings home this sense of her or him, Claudine, being trapped in not just a body that he feels like isn't really his own, but stuck in a culture that is not anything that he feels comfortable in. So, I mean, I liked that fact, and I think readers could easily see where the doctor, trying to be empathic as he can, nonetheless doesn't really understand things completely.
I think that's a good point to bring up, that it does, that added layer of mediation does kind of underscore the element of misunderstanding. And I mean, it really is the drama of this story really derives from these repeated instances of Claudine believing himself to have found someone who understands him, and then, encountering a moment where he is forced to realize in a really devastating way that they ultimately don't. And so, I think that's a good point to bring up, that it does, the narrative conceit or the narrative framework through the doctor does in many ways serve to underscore that. But do you think that kind of emphasis on, I would say sentimentality, though I would try and make clear that I'm not using that term pejoratively, but just to refer to the narrative's kind of emphasis on emotion and these very dramatic and kind of Baroque, almost emotional expressions and scenes of emotional expression. Do you think that is kind of a condition of the book being a kind of shōjo work, or?
I do think that some of the things that you mentioned, the sentimentality, the use of emotion to kind of drive the narrative, I think partly it's the function of it being an example of shōjo manga. I also get the sense that Riyoko Ikeda is known for this kind of writing. And I say I get the sense because what Ikeda is most famously known for, is her book, The Rose of Versailles. And even though that's not necessarily a trans story, it is the story of a young woman who plays a male role in filling in for the father in terms of palace guards, I believe. Now, I have not read The Rose of Versailles, but I've read about it. And so that's why I say from everything I can gather in reading about Ikeda's work, specifically The Rose of Versailles, I get the sense that there is this kind of emphasis on the emotions. And much of this, at least in Claudine, seems to come out in the art. In other words, the way that Ikeda illustrates Claudine, I think other characters as well, but especially Claudine, is in a very, at times frilly, and not just in terms of the clothes that Claudine wears, which at times can be quite frilly, but also in the settings and the background. It's very detailed, Baroque. And you will find, I'm looking at right now, what page is this of the text? It's something like page 9, I think it is. 9. And we have an image of Claudine, and in the background are a couple of roses and what looks like bubbles. And so this is something like you will find throughout the book, is that whenever Claudine especially is represented visually, there does seem to be a kind of romantic, if you will, context in which he's presented.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the art, because that was an element of this that I really wanted to talk about. For people who aren't super familiar with Riyoko, Ikeda, or shōjo manga, she's part of this group of mangaka called the Year 24 group. It's a group of cartoonists who were, I believe, born in the 24th year of the Showa era. And it's a lot of women. Moto Hagio was part of this group. And they kind of renovated the manga industry in a big bad way. They, introduced modern shōjo and modern josei. And I think that's interesting. That's interesting to keep in mind, because I was really reminded reading this of, and this is my first time reading anything by Ikeda. I was really reminded of Moto Hagio. I don't think their work is identical. I mean, certainly the content and the kind of way they choose to tell their stories is distinct. But there was a similar, they have a similar way of drawing bodies as these very wispy, very lithe thing. It's a lot of very tall, skinny forms. Like you said, a lot of detail, a lot of curved, wispy lines. I think you use the term Baroque to describe it, and I think that's a really good way to think about this as something that's both incredibly stylized, but also very ornate and detailed. And I thought that kind of aesthetic was really successful in bringing together this narrative that in many ways functions very similarly, bringing together these very realistic scenes with that are punctuated by very heightened emotional states or emotional expressions.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up Moto Hagio, because I got the same sense from Claudine in terms of the style and especially the art. In reading Hagio's work, and not only Otherworld Barbara, but also her book, The Heart of Thomas, where you have kind of similar to Claudine, the main character, the protagonist, you have a main character in Heart of Thomas, who also is represented in a very attractive feminine manner, even though there are issues of gender and gender identification involved. And it seems like many times Hagio's characters, especially, let's say, Thomas and Heart of Thomas, is represented. It's in a similar way that I was describing with Claudine. It's a very detailed, very romantic, I use the word Baroque, background or backdrop against which the main character is set. And so there is that kind of emphasis on emotion and romance in many ways.
Yeah, I know in the past we've talked about other shōjo or josei titles, and we've kind of repeatedly hit upon this. I think what is, for people who are familiar with those kinds of manga, I want to say genre, but that might be a little bit of a misleading term. But those kinds of genres, those manga forms that have these shared kind of conventions and tropes. And one of those conventions or tropes that we've kind of repeatedly hit upon when we've talked about works in that category is that emphasis on romance and sentimentality. And I know in the past there have been some works that kind of because of that you haven't been as keen on as I have. So I was curious kind of what you made, how much you enjoyed Claudine generally, and what you made of specifically of Ikeda's use of that convention.
About the sentimentality, or
the kind of emphasis on sentimentality, or the kind of really dispersing the drama through these kind of punctuated moments of really heightened sentimentality.
I enjoyed it well enough given the context. And again, it's kind of like Hagio. Once I started reading, I more or less knew what to expect. For instance, even the men, in every sense of the word, not just in terms of gender identification, but the biologically born males in Claudine, for the most part, seem to be drawn in a, if you want to describe it as feminine, very attractive, almost delicate manner. And so I just kind of assumed that is the way that Ikeda writes, just as that's very similar to the way that Hagio writes. And so taking it within that context, in other words, if another mangaka had drawn in that way, it may have thrown me off. But knowing that this is the style of Ikeda, it's fine. And so the tone of the emotional, the sentimentality, the romance just became part and parcel of her style for me.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, it sounds like then, our opinions are kind of split in the same way that they were a little on Moto Hagio, because it sounds like I was a little keener on Ikeda's drawing. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but so correct me if I'm wrong. But it sounds like you enjoyed it well enough, but you weren't you weren't head over heels for it or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I wasn't head over heels for the story overall, but I don't think it's a function of anything that Ikeda did in terms of either the art or just storytelling tropes that she employs. I think it may be the fact that this is an older kind of manga, and as many listeners will know from having read, let's say, manga from the 60s and 70s, and then comparing it to more contemporary stuff, like we're going to be doing later with the Higashimura book that we're going to be talking about on this episode. There are differences in the kind of storytelling that happens now and then what we may have seen about 30, 40 years ago. And so I wasn't completely bowled over by Claudine, but I very much appreciated it, maybe more as a historical text, especially given the fact that it was dealing with issues of gender identity and trans issues well before many creators, either in Japan or in the West, felt free to do so.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair to point out, and totally accurate. I think you're spot on when you say that there are, the storytelling or aesthetic sensibilities, they change over time. And so naturally, kind of what was being published in the 60s and 70s, what was popular in the 60s and 70s, what works from that era endure and are influential they're going to look and feel very different from, what we would consider kind of contemporary works that are popular or that are kind of dominating the publishing industry now. But I think I think maybe I'm just for some reason I just enjoy maybe those aesthetic sensibilities a little bit more. I found that that's kind of a recurring thing on the podcast that I've noticed that I tend to enjoy the older works maybe a little bit more than you do, and I'm not entirely sure what that is, but whereas you were not totally thrilled by Claudine, I was actually really taken with it. You mentioned Ikeda's art, and there's some stuff she does with paneling in this book that I was really taken with. For example, she has this thing she does, and I'm not sure if this is something she does in her other works or not, because, like I said, this is the first thing of hers I've read. But in this, she kind of repeatedly uses this thing where she has a kind of a descending sequence of panels where she'll have 2 or 3 or 4 panels, vertical panels in a row that they're the same proportions, they have the same width, but they get shorter and shorter in this descending sequence. And I found things like that she was doing did it to create really like these really effective rhythms of pages and stuff. And so there were little things in that that I just totally was wowed by, that I wasn't expecting at all.
I noticed that as well, that kind of paneling strategy that you had mentioned. I do want to correct you, or if not correct you, then amend a couple of things that you said. Mm-hmm. You said that you get the sense that you tend to enjoy the older manga more than I do. It all depends. Like, for instance, one of the things we discussed on our last episode, the May show in early June, was Baron Yoshimoto's work. And so that kind of gekiga, right? Mm-hmm. I absolutely love. And in many ways, I will take that over most of what's coming out today, any day of the week. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there are certain titles, older titles, that are just being translated or at least coming into new editions that we have discussed on this manga series that are okay, but there's something about the storytelling style that doesn't resonate with me. And so, and I don't want to say that Claudine is one of those, but again, I mean, I did enjoy the story, and I do appreciate the what Ikeda was doing in the narrative. It's just, I guess, some of the maybe more emotional, sentimental aspects of the narrative didn't bowl me over. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think you're right to point out that that you tend to have pretty strong opinions on when we talk about the gekiga, and I think that's consistent with kind of the sorts of contemporary comics or older American comics that I know you enjoy, and maybe works like Claudine, the kind of the shōjo josei, are, maybe it's not that the vintage of the book, but just the aesthetic kind of conventions that those different forms are working with. Because I actually don't know your opinion on like Emma Rios, but I'm a huge Emma Rios fan. For listeners who aren't familiar with her, she's a Spanish cartoonist who's done books like Pretty Deadly, and she edited Island, and reading Claudine, I was really struck by how so much of the kind of paneling that Ikeda does is reminded me of the way that I've seen Emma Rios lay out panels sometimes. And so, yeah, maybe it's just that this particular work was just kind of consistent with the contemporary forms that I tend to enjoy. Whereas, like you mentioned, the Baron Yoshimoto book from that we talked about on the last episode is maybe more consistent with the conventions and forms of comics that you like, regardless of vintage.
Right. Another thing that I enjoyed about Claudine are the various twists and turns that the narrative takes. Now, I've already mentioned, although without going into detail, that the life of Claudine, the young life of Claudine, growing up as a teenager and then as a young adult, is filled with ups and downs. And these ups and downs are primarily linked to her relationship with others. So, for instance, there's one childhood friend who becomes important throughout the story, and that is Rosemary. And Rosemary understands it, and this is ironic. Rosemary, even as a teenager, understands, at least to a large degree, where Claudine is coming from, and she tries to make herself available to him, to Claudine. But Claudine is not really drawn to Rosemary as a potential lover, I guess just as a friend. And Rosemary is nonetheless, as they grow up, rather persistent in, I don't know if you want to call it pursuing Claudine, but reminding Claudine that she's possibly interested. But Claudine is interested in several other younger women over the course of the story. And I think one of the most prominent of which is a woman by the name of Mara, who comes to work with the De Monteses, which is Claudine's family, as a housekeeper, I guess. And they begin to have something, but I think that it's Claudine's mother that catches her kissing Mara, or him kissing Mara, and then decides to send Mara back home. So that Claudine won't have that temptation. But there are also other women that Claudine is interested in. When she becomes a little older, there is a woman by the name of Sirene. I'm not sure how you pronounce that name, Sirene. And this woman is, I think she meets her in college, doesn't she? Or is it in high school? I can't remember.
Yeah, it's there in college when they meet.
And then there is Cecilia, whose brother, Louise, is the tutor of Rosemary. This becomes significant in that this brings in the added complication of Claudine's father, who, at least in the first half of the narrative, seems to be a kind of upstanding, supportive, and understanding parent figure. However, there's something about her father that is rather secretive, that Claude, and I don't want to give it anything away because it, I guess, would be approaching spoiler territory, but Claudine learns about this secret the hard way. I mean, I don't know how much to say about what happens with the father, but it's an important plot point toward the last half. Yeah.
I think that kind of what's, without giving anything away, I think what's important to take away is that we've mentioned that this is kind of an older work, and so it's some of its ideas about gender identity, gender expression, things like that are maybe outdated, and maybe because of that there are some problematic aspects, some misgendering on the part of the narrator, some scenes that are kind of questionable, little moments like that. But I do think that the work is noteworthy and kind of still worth reading even today, because like you mentioned that the book is interesting historically because Ikeda was grappling with these questions and these issues long before they were something that were household terms or kind of more commonly talked about. But I do think, unlike even maybe people who are working today, who are trying to tell these stories today, I think what Ikeda does really successfully and really movingly is render Claudine as a really complex, really psychologically complicated figure who has a variety of wants and desires, who feels very deeply a plethora of kind of emotions in ways that I think a lot of times queer characters today, I think in terms of raw numbers, maybe representation of queer people is higher than in years past, but I've still noticed this recurrent problem of representing these people as full people, as very detailed and complicated people. But I think Ikeda does that really successfully, and she writes this character with so much depth and so much complication. I think it totally makes it worth it. And obviously, that's kind of to kind of relate it to what you were saying more kind of explicitly. I think that is evident in the way that Ikeda really tells this story through Claudine's relationships with these other people, with these other women, and with these other men.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that actually what you just said kind of brings me back to that earlier point that I made that was based on a question that you had posed about the narrator. Again, I come back to the significance of the Doctor as the narrator and not completely understanding Claudine. And to me, that's one of the main points of this book, is that Claudine is, as you put it, a complicated character, a fully fleshed out and realized human in, all of the positive and potentially negative aspects that defines all humans. The Doctor not completely understanding Claudine suggests, either, I guess maybe at best an unreliable narrator, perhaps at worst a naive narrator, maybe even be a better way of putting that, because he doesn't really know enough to understand Claudine and where he's coming from. And so again, that really drives home the point that Claudine is living in a world that really doesn't understand him. So
yeah, I think that's that's certainly a fair point to make. And I think, you can definitely see that in the narrative. But I can't help but think, maybe what would this look like if it was told from maybe Rosemary's perspective,
That's a good question.
As we find out, has a completely different perspective on Claudine than Claudine himself and the women that Claudine has relationships with, and so I think yes, you're right to point out that the Doctor does provide us a way of kind of exploring that question of misunderstanding that's really core to the story. But I also think there are ways to accomplish that. Obviously I'm not, it was 1978. I'm not, going to yell at Riyoko Ikeda for not having this kind of perfect book that conforms to kind of what we would expect and want from a contemporary author. But, I can't help but think, what would this story look like from say Rosemary's perspective?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to speculate on how the narration or the narrative point of view may shift a bit if Rosemary were the one telling Claudine's story. On the other hand, remember, Rosemary is very drawn to Claudine, so there is a kind of prejudice that's kind of baked into that character's perspective. At the same time, though, and this is why I think that and again, I'm just speculating why the Doctor may have been used. For all his faults, he is nonetheless a man of science, a man of reason. And so that could also underscore the potential limitations of this kind of rational worldview that's just, again, part of the culture of Claudine and where she's grown up. So it's not only a male physician that is getting things a little incomplete and a little wrong. It is science that really doesn't understand what's going on with Claudine and trans sensibilities.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, like we've repeatedly mentioned, the kind of time in which Ikeda was making this. I can, we can criticize it from the vantage point of today, of 2018, but I think we're right to point out maybe some problematic language or some instances of less than ideal representations of this or that. But I can totally see why in 1978 Ikeda would have felt that that this doctor, or even not this doctor, but this specific character who has this specific kind of empathetic relationship, or tries to have an empathetic relationship with Claudine within the kind of frameworks available to him at the time. I think I can absolutely see why Ikeda might have made that choice. And yeah.
Well, Shea, you want to move on to the second text that we're going to be looking at this month?
Yeah, let's take a look at Tokyo Tarareba Girls.
That's right. This is by Akiko Higashimura, and it's coming out this month from Kodansha Comics. And Higashimura is a name that should be familiar to listeners of the manga series. A while back, a couple years ago, you and I discussed her previous series, at least the previous one translated into English, Princess Jellyfish. And a couple of months ago, we even brought her up again when we were doing that kind of catch-up show, where we were talking about the second volume of The World Barbara and then the remainder of Monster. And then we were talking about some of the other manga that we may have been keeping up with. I had mentioned Princess Jellyfish and reading not all of it, but reading more than, let's say, you and I initially read when we looked at the first volume of Higashimura's series. So now we get a new work from Higashimura, Tokyo Tarareba Girls. And, let's start off by just trying to define what is meant by that second word in the title, Tarareba Girls. Now, the way that Higashimura describes it in the notes in the back is that Tarareba is, in essence, the phrase, what if? And this becomes quite significant in this book. But it's a combination of the word Tara and also Reba. And the way that Higashimura describes it is that Tara is the name for codfish milt. And I had to look up milt. And when I found out what it was, I didn't feel that appetizing to me. Fish sperm.
Oh, it's okay. So I for some reason didn't look it up. I should have. I probably should have. So I'm looking it up right now. So if you look up codfish milt, you'll see that it does have that kind of lumpy, kind of bubble-like look to it, and that's the way that Higashimura draws it throughout this first volume of Tokyo Tarareba Girls. Oh, now, wow. That really is not an appetizing
No, now that's Tara. Now the Reba is liver. And the reason why Tara and Reba, or codfish milt and liver, are important in this book is that whenever our protagonist, Rinko, and her friends, Kaori and Koyuji, go out to, drink and eat together, many times they will have, especially if they're at the bar, food like Tara or Reba or codfish milt and liver. And so they eat that all the time, and, more power to them. I mean, the liver part I can put up with, I guess. And maybe the codfish milt would taste good. I've just never had it, and I'm being a little too prejudiced here.
Well, yeah, like I said, I've eaten like roe. I've eaten the eggs, like the fish eggs. So it might be a little bit hypocritical of me to write off milt completely, but it doesn't look. It looks like I might have some trouble with the texture. But.
Yeah, may taste good. Who knows? But together, the word Tarareba is what if, and that's the phrase that seems to guide not only everything in this story that goes on with our protagonist Rinko, a young woman of 33 years old, but also her friends. Because anytime Rinko, Kaori, and Koyuji get together to drink and to eat together and to commiserate with one another, they're accused of engaging in this kind of what if mentality. You know, what if I had paid attention to this guy years ago, I wouldn't be in the state I was right now. What if I did such and such? What if this were not the case? What if that? So they're really good at speculating and, if we want to call it this, Monday morning quarterbacking on their lives to the point that it seems that that's all they're doing, and they're really not engaging with the things in their lives, right? They're just reflecting on it or bemoaning the fact that they did or didn't do something. And so that's where this what if comes from. And every now and again in this first volume, we see actually some codfish melt and a piece of liver are animated, and it's like they're talking with Rinko, and they go, what if? You know, what if this happened? What if you didn't do something? And so they pop up every now and again. And, you know, that's one of the things I like about not only Tokyo Tarareba Girls, but also Higashimura's work in general. We saw something a little similar with Princess Jellyfish, where there seemed to be, let's say, an outward visual manifestation of inward emotions. I noticed that so much more with the Tokyo Tarareba Girls than I did with Princess Jellyfish. Now, what I mean by that is there are occasions where Rinko will experience something. Like, for instance, the one time she goes out on a date with the man that she works with, or one of the men that she works with, Hayasaka. And she went out with him earlier, and we get that in a flashback earlier in life. But now at 33, she goes out with him again, and she thinks that he is going to, kind of like he did years ago, express his affections for her. And she's kind of ready for this, you know, gets a new dress and is ready to accept whatever gift he may give her. And then when Hayasaka shows a box that has jewelry in it, has a ring, opens the box, and then says, "What do you think, Mami-san?" A really young coworker, a woman in the office, will think of this. The reaction is a lightning bolt strikes Rinko. Now, realistically, a lightning bolt doesn't come down from out of nowhere and strike Rinko, but that's what it feels like to her. And so that's just one of several instances where the inner emotion is given outward expression through something quite catastrophic that doesn't actually happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really great scene to point to, and I think it really highlights a lot of that, what I liked about the book. You know, you mentioned that her feeling struck by this kind of shock or surprise or embarrassment or whatever is represented by her literally being struck by a bolt of lightning. What I really love about that scene is that it cuts back and forth from the man talking to her and kind of explaining kind of what he means and what he wants to her, and like, oh, do you think she'll like it? And then it keeps cutting back to Rinko, who's like falling out of the sky with like all of this rubble. So I think, you know, it's she really does commit to these kind of visual metaphors for an emotional state in ways that I think really effective, in the sense that they really, I think, clearly communicate the emotional state of the character, but they also are really funny. You know, it's a really in some ways a really powerful and compelling visual metaphor, but the way it's kind of it's elaborated is really actually very funny. And I thought Higashimura's ability, and this is one of the things I liked about Princess Jellyfish as well, but her ability to tell these stories about women's lives and the maybe challenges or difficulties or anxieties that are pretty common for, you know, whatever reason. But she's able to do them. She's able to tell them and to tell them seriously without denuding them of humor and of levity. And so you have a series that it varies tonally from kind of moment to moment, scene to scene, chapter to chapter, and those the changes in tone are handled really, really effectively, I think.
Right. Now, we should also mention that this is an example of josei, and that this manga, Tokyo Tarareba Girls, originally appeared in the manga magazine Kiss between 2014 and 2017. I think it wrapped up in April. So this series is already completed in the original Japanese, but we're just starting to get the first volume, which came out this month in English. Now, the premise for this, we've kind of talked around it, but I think it's worth mentioning that the setup of Tokyo Tarareba Girls, Rinko, again, is the protagonist. And basically, the story begins around the time that she turns 33 years old, and she realizes, I've got a good job, I seem to have an okay life, but yet there's something that's incomplete about this. I'm in my early 30s. At this point, I should have a relationship. In other words, she feels that she should have a man that she's involved with, and that she may have kind of screwed up some opportunities in the past. One example of that is with her coworker, Hayasaka, and that by the time the Tokyo Olympics come in 2020, she wants to be married to someone. And so she expresses this to her friends, Kaori and Koyuji. They feel the same way. And so anytime that Rinko, Kaori, and Koyuji get together, they're commiserating on the fact that either they screwed up something with a guy, or they're complaining about the fact that they don't have a guy, or they're trying to find some excuse for why a particular man that one of them went out with didn't really work out. And that's basically the setup of Tokyo Tarareba Girls, or at least this first volume. A complication occurs, especially in the last half of this first volume, with a male character by the name of Kei. And I believe that's how you pronounce his name. K-E-Y? Kei? It's not Key.
Well, actually, I was pronouncing it Key, but you're probably right. It is probably K, and I was just not thinking. But yeah, I think K. I think that's a fair.
Call him K.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there, Rinko, Kaori, and Koyuji are at a bar that Koyuji, I believe's father owns. And so every now and again, he'll complain about, these three women, all they do is sit in there, kind of anger some of the customers with their complaints and get drunk. And there's a lot of drinking in this book. But there's one young male character that at first they don't know who this guy is, but he overhears them a couple of times when they're getting together for what they call like a 4-alarm meeting. So when something goes wrong with Rinko and one of the guys that she's interested in, and she wants to talk with her friends about it, she'll text Kaori and Koyuji, it's a 4-alarm. Let's get together. And so they go to the bar and they drink and get drunk and complain to one another. And Kei overhears them a couple of times, and at one point before he leaves, he tells them, you're just like a bunch of old women who are just sitting around and complaining, talking about what if. That's all you do. Get a life. And that kind of pisses them off, especially Rinko. And Rinko later learns that Kei is, a somewhat popular male model, a very young man, significantly younger than Rinko. I guess he's in his 20s. And also, Rinko is a writer for a web series, and so she has what she feels as a secure career, and she has a strong script. And by chance, Kei is one of the model / wannabe actors who comes to, I guess he auditions for a part. He doesn't necessarily want it. Rinko's coworkers, especially her boss, want him because he's such a good-looking and I guess fairly popular figure. But Rinko doesn't want Kei to have anything to do with her script. And then they decide not to use her script. Her boss says, well, you can do something else. And so not only does her love life seem at an end point, but also her career, the way that she sees this. And so then Rinko really begins to feel sorry for herself, primarily because of this figure K.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that this first volume is largely concerned with this group of women, these what-if girls, really kind of bemoaning the state of their own life and really unable to do anything but lament the fact that this or that didn't go a different way earlier in their life. But I do think that I'm really excited to see kind of how Higashimura kind of develops the story in later volumes, particularly this relationship between Rinko and Kei that you talked about just now. Because there are some things that happen later in the story that are very promising for future volumes. I'm definitely curious to see kind of how it plays out. But also, looking at the notes of Higashimura's that you mentioned are included in the back of this first volume. She, it's not uncommon for mangaka to include these short kind of asides where they talk directly to the audience. And in this one, Higashimura talks about how her own experience with marriage and with single motherhood, mm-hmm. and all of her friends who are in their 30s who are kind of making the same complaints that these what if women are, so I really do see Higashimura as developing this story about these characters really having to figure out what happiness looks like for them, and to kind of realize that it's okay if maybe their life does not look the way that other people tell them it is supposed to. That it's good to kind of discover what works for you and what is right for you. And so I'm really interested to see how Higashimura kind of develops that idea and plays it out over the next, 8 volumes of this.
Is it 8 or 9? I know that the Japanese was 9 volumes.
Yeah, well, 8 the next 8, I should say.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to follow this title as well, but what you've said kind of raises an issue, and I wanted to ask your reaction to this, Shea, because I found, at least in this first volume, a kind of disjunctiveness between the narrative proper and then the bonus story that we get at the very end of this volume of Tokyo Tarareba Girls. And for those familiar with Princess Jellyfish, this is something similar that Higashimura did with that series, in that in the collected volumes in English, you would get an additional story or a bonus story that probably didn't have anything to do with what was going on in Princess Jellyfish for the most part, but was telling you something about Higashimura's life, or maybe some reasons behind why she was writing, in the earlier instance, Princess Jellyfish. And we have something similar going on here with the bonus story, where Higashimura basically gives us, at least to some degree, the genesis of Tokyo Tarareba Girls. Now, what I mean by disjunctiveness, my experience in reading this first volume is that with Rinko and then her 2 friends especially, there seemed to be an emphasis on men being able to complete in certain ways the lives of women. In other words, that when Rinko and Kaori and Koyuji get together, they feel that something is missing. And what seems to be missing, if it comes right down to it, if we want to put it this way, is a man in their life. Now, I don't know, as I was reading this, I was saying, I don't know if this is the most positive message for, let's say, female empowerment. Then we get to the bonus story, okay? And at one point, and I'm on the second page here of the bonus story, where Higashimura says, she's talking about the origins of this title, this series. I don't believe even for a second that, quote, women have to get married, unquote, or, quote, a woman's happiness depends on her man, unquote, or, quote, any woman who doesn't get married is pitiful, unquote. In fact, I'm one of those people who wish they could have lived the celebrated life of a single aristocrat, never getting married and enjoying their career without being tied down. And then she tells us about her experiences with her first marriage. Now, to me, there seems to be a disconnection between Higashimura's message in that bonus comic when she's telling us about her own feelings about men in her life and the role of marriage, and then what we see being played out in the story of Rinko, Kaori, and Koyuji, and especially with Rinko. I don't get that sense from Rinko and her friends that they truly believe, like their authors, that women don't need to get married, that women can stand on their own, that they're complete even without a man in their lives.
No, I think that's a good question to raise. So the sense that I got was that you're right. I don't think that these three central characters, these three central women, I don't think that they share Higashimura's perspective at the outset of the narrative. And I think you're right to point out that when they are kind of bemoaning the state of their life, it really does come down to, I need a man, I need to get married. I think that's a fair observation. The sense that I got, though, this will have to be borne out in later volumes, and so I could be wrong, or Higashimura could take the narrative in a different direction than what I'm kind of anticipating. But the sense that I got was that, yes, they are these what if women are they are laboring under the belief that they need a man to complete their life. And what I'm kind of thinking is going to happen, and I hope is right, is that Higashimura will eventually we'll see these characters kind of come to the realization and work this problem out for themselves, and eventually come to the realization that the problem wasn't that they didn't have a man in their life. The problem was that they spent so much energy and so much time and so much effort thinking about men, concerning themselves with whether or not they had a man, making decisions based on this idea that they need this, that, and the other thing so that they can land a man, so that they can get married by this age, so that they can be happy. My sense is that we are seeing the characters start from this position of feeling that a man is necessary for them to be happy, and hopefully we'll see them progress to a state that is more kind of consistent with Higashimura's stated position. That was, I do think that large parts of this first volume at least seem sort of inconsistent with with that kind of bonus story, or that like aside to the audience. And I think if I had read that after maybe if I had read that first, or if I had read that maybe 3/4 of the way in, I would see how I would be confused at how if this is kind of how she's approaching things, why the story looks this way, I wouldn't be able. But I got the impression based on the last scene that it was going towards that direction that was kind of promised by that end story, or that extra story.
Yeah. Now you were talking about the end scene, and again, we don't want to give away any spoilers, but this last scene of this first volume involves Kay, where Rinko seems to be kind of eating and drinking herself into a particular state, and which her friends tend to think that is a tendency of hers, that when she gets down on herself, she starts indulging in things a little too much, especially drink. And she can hurt herself. She'll eventually pass out, or maybe someone will take advantage of her. And in this last scene, Kay says that he will go and help her. In other words, he's going to take that bottle of really nice sake away from her. And And he does, but his answer to helping her involves something that is set up that I'm assuming that we'll see in the first part of the next volume. And we can kind of anticipate it. I have to say, I really do hope that it's not what I think it is, or that eventually Rinko grows away from that, because, you know, Kei as a character wasn't attractive to me at all. I mean, he seemed to be, you know, he's a young male model, so maybe that's one of the reasons why I don't identify with him in any way whatsoever. But he also seems, to some degree, a little vapid in terms of his opinions. On the other hand, he does make some astute observations, you know, for instance, accusing Rinko and her friends of being nothing more than gabbing what-if girls and not really doing anything with their lives. But again, what he seems to represent doesn't seem to be the most positive of models for anyone to follow. And so I'm really hoping that what we see potentially set up at the very last part of this first volume of Tokyo Tarareba Girls doesn't transpire the way I think it will.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be a little harsher than you. I think Kei is a little snotty, snotty asshole. But I do think I get the sense that we're not really supposed to like him, but I do think that maybe he is, in certain ways and for certain things, what Rinko needs at this moment to force her to change how she is engaging with her own life. And I am also hoping that he is not the I'm hoping he's not the love interest for the entire series. But yeah, I do think that I get the sense that he will serve an important role in Rinko's kind of coming to understand her own needs and desires a little better.
Right, even if that role is inadvertent.
Yeah. I don't think it's a selfless mission he's on.
I agree. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this first volume of Tokyo Tarareba Girls is the comedy. I mean, I think you could describe this series, at least what we can tell from the first volume, as kind of a comedy / romance, or rom-com, if you want to call it that. And I do appreciate Higashimura's sense of humor in Tokyo Tarareba Girls, even more than I did. And I think it's more prominent than we found in Princess Jellyfish, which had its share of humor. And to me, most of the humor is embedded in this character of Rinko, because she does strike me. I don't know, for some reason, Lucille Ball immediately came to mind. But I mean, she's a main figure who is somewhat like that. I mean, she is the driving force behind this series, but she's not without her faults. And some of those humorous faults are even of the physical quality. So, for instance, she seems to, at least for much of this first volume, be in bandages in one form or another, on her head or on her arm. In other words, bumping into something or falling down. And so that just strikes me that she is, maybe you could call like a female Schlemiel. And, you know, something always happening to her, even physically, where she is temporarily hurt to where she has to wear a bandage, which shows that she's been through a lot of stuff. But it's handled in such a humorous way that you can't help but laugh and think, I don't know, rather nicely of the character Rinko because of the humor aspects.
Yeah, I think that's fair to point out. And like we were talking about with Claudine and the kind of protagonist of that book, what is really effective about that book is this complexity and depth and of the character, a character who isn't just one thing. They are allowed to be multiple things. They're allowed to be sad and upset and angry and goofy and comedic, and you know, one of those things doesn't contradict or nullify the other. And so yeah, I think one of the reasons I really enjoyed it is like you said, this I think the comedy is really effective. But more than that, I think Higashimura is able to balance it with Rinko being occupying a variety of emotional states and really being sad and being upset and being angry, and then a page later smashing her head on a Olympics statue from 1969 or whatever, and really injuring herself, and then later slamming her forehead on the table out of kind of mock embarrassment, and then actually really hurting herself. Those moments are funny.
Getting drunk and falling down.
Yeah. Those moments of comedy are funny, but they don't make those moments where she is sad or where she is grappling with this really serious issue of getting older and really being unhappy with the state of her life. They don't lessen the affect of those serious scenes. And so, like you said, the comedy is really great, but I was most impressed by how well Higashimura was able to balance that multiplicity of tones so well.
Yeah. And that reminds me what you just said, that at the same time that she seems to be kind of a nicely pathetic, let me put it that way, comedic figure, on the other hand, she's empowered in other ways. So even though in terms of her love life and to a certain degree maybe her career, she seems to be at a bit of a disadvantage here, on the other hand, she is not hurting when it comes to her security. And as she puts this, I think it's in the last chapter of the story, she says at one point, when a 30-something woman has no luck in love or work, her best weapon is her bank account. And it's her bank account that allows her to indulge and to become, again, I use the word empowered in ways that I think she wouldn't be if she were really, in a more complete way, down on her luck, right? So if she lost her job, if she had no money whatsoever, if she was completely unlucky at love, then she would be a truly pathetic character. And it would be a little harder, I think, to identify with her. But she does have those weaknesses, but at the same time, there are some strong points that are undergirding Rinko.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she is a really... I'll be interested to see how Higashimura kind of continues to develop her, but I think in this first volume, Rinko is a multifaceted character, and I think this book really speaks to the kind of potential of letting a greater diversity of people tell stories that are particular to them, and tell stories that are from their kind of unique perspective, because, especially now that I know a little bit more about Higashimura's background and her particular relationship to marriage and all her friends who have this kind of anxious relationship to wanting to be in a relationship. I think telling this story and telling it with layers to it and with dimension to it is something that, I don't know if a lot of other cartoonists would be able to pull off. And I have a hard time believing that a man who is completely alienated from this sort of experience, or if they're alienated from it in a totally different way. I don't think they would be able to tell this story this effectively. And I think this really speaks to the necessity to let people tell different kinds of stories and to tell their own story.
Well, Shea, we looked at two really interesting books that came out this month. We started off with Riyoko Ikeda's Claudine, which was just published from or by Seven Seas Entertainment. Now, originally the book was published in Japanese in 1978, but it's now available in English. And then we looked at the first volume of Akiko Higashimura's Tokyo Tarareba Girls from Kodansha Comics. So two really good titles that we're working with this month.
Yeah, I really enjoyed both these books.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to find great manga like this, then you should definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Now, if you check right now, unfortunately, you'll see that they don't have Claudine, but they do, as I'm looking at their website right now, have not only Volume 1, but also Volume 2 available for pre-order from DCB Service at 30% off the cover price. So each of these volumes would cost you only $9.09. And as Shea and I were discussing, this new title we think is worth it. So check out the great prices at dcbservice.com. And after you do get your manga there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. And if you want to email both of us, you can email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to email me specifically, you can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, what is your email address?
Curiously enough, it's derek@comicsalternative.com. And you can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. We're all over the place. Mm-hmm. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. And with this episode, we are caught up now, Shea. Our June episode in June.
That's right. Yep. Back on track.
That's right. And we will be back in July with our July manga episode. So keep your ears open for that. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
Take care.